Now, the identification part of it is the last stage of this specific outcome. Alex is going to tap into that right now.
Yeah, so the requirement in the FAR is very basic. Identify government-owned in a manner appropriate to the property type, right? We can use a stamp, a tag, a marking. Maybe we keep stuff if it never leaves the room in a room with a large, government property tag on it, or a shelf of some sort. The key is we need to define how we identify property. And it needs to be readily identifiable, right? As I'm walking down the floor and I'm looking around, I see a piece of property. I should be able to tell whether or not that's government property just by looking at it. Now, I know Peter, I apologize if I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we're going to talk a little bit about barcodes and RFIDs, or Peter will take us through that. One important thing is to realize is those are tools that enable a lot of different things: tracking movement, potentially doing inventories and things like that. In and of themselves, none of them, I would argue, meet this requirement because they are not readily identifying something as government property. So we have to be careful when we say in our procedures, if they say we identify government property with an RFID tag. Well, maybe. It all depends on what that tag looks like. You may have a different colored tag or a tag that actually says government property. These are things you need to be aware of and consider when you're implementing some of these newer technologies, especially as they relate to this identification requirement. I think it's a really easy one to sort of have some self-inflicted wounds if we're not careful and we're not intentional about things. Peter, over to you.
Yeah, no, that's a great point that you make, because just to slap a barcode on something is not necessarily meeting the obligations. But the thing that I want everyone to think about here as we talk about identification is that this is setting the stage for what ultimately will be much more efficient processes downstream. So it's not just about the government part of the identification, it's also about what you can be doing as best practice within your organization to help you become more effective at your job. You run a very professional part of your organization, and it's got lots of implication on the success of these contracts. So you got to think about strategically, how do you do it the right way? So let's talk about the different possibilities. We know that there's barcode today. A lot of linear barcodes make it on government property, and it's also the primary means in which to track inventory if it's beyond manual anyway. The IUID is another kind of barcode. Of course, many know that that is the government mandated if you have the MIL standard 130 requirement as part of your obligation. But again, these are just two barcodes that can be scanned using different mobile computer technologies or desktop technologies to be able to perform some kind of a, say, a life cycle function about that particular item at the right point in time. Why barcode? Well, it improves the accuracy and it improves the ability to process more quickly in that case. RFID, now that's also yet another new technology that actually has been proven itself over the past 10 years now, really in the industry. And RFID has a one reader to many assets relationship because it uses a radio signal, and you can actually track hundreds of items within a few seconds of pulling a trigger on a mobile computer and capturing whatever is within the range. So what's interesting about this is it requires you to start thinking about the key decision points. First of all, what is my contract obligation and how do I meet that? But then beyond that, what supports the most effective audit readiness that you need to be prepared for? And what operational efficiencies can you leverage? So it sets up the downstream process needs. Now, I use an example I like where we were working with a defense contractor who had an MRO contract, and they were doing maintenance, repair, and overhaul for these Army vehicles that were coming back in. And their job was to, of course, take apart all the sub-assemblies for one of these vehicles. And part of it is they had this IUID obligation where they needed to mark the parts as they pulled the parts away from the final assembly. Now that gave them an opportunity here because they had to perform the marking on these parts with the IUID, they were applying IUID marks, which are globally unique identifiers, marking the individual parts. As they built it back up again and prepared the bill of materials so that ultimately the final assembly knew exactly what was under that hierarchy, that tree, it ultimately gave them an opportunity to use that for a quality check and leveraging barcode scanning as that final item was being assembled, ready to go back out again and be reintroduced into the world.